Spent 31 years as a family court social worker, and the one thing that job taught me, the thing nobody tells you until you've seen it enough times to recognize it in your sleep, is that abuse doesn't announce itself at the door. It slides in quietly, wearing a good suit and a warm smile, and by the time you notice the damage, it's already been living in your house for years. I retired at 63, moved back to Savannah, Georgia, to be closer to my daughter and her husband. I thought that chapter of my life, the one where I sat across from broken families and tried to piece them back together, was behind me. I was wrong. My daughter's name is Imani. She was 28 when this happened. A gifted woman. She had finished her master's in education and was teaching third grade at an elementary school in Pooler. She had her father's eyes and my stubbornness, which I used to think was a blessing. I understand now that stubbornness can also keep a person silent when they should be screaming. She met her husband at a friend's wedding reception. His name was Theo, he liked to be called. He was 32, worked in commercial real estate, and he had the kind of easy confidence that fills a room without trying. He was attentive in the way that felt genuine then. He remembered small things, what Imani's favorite tea was, that she didn't like overhead lighting, that she always ordered her steak medium, never well done. He called it paying attention. I called it charming. I didn't call it what it actually was until much later. They dated for 14 months. He proposed on a Tuesday evening at home, not at some restaurant. Just the two of them. Quiet, the way Imani had always said she wanted it, if that day ever came. She called me immediately after, and I could hear it in her voice. Not just happiness, but the kind of relief a person feels when they believe they've finally found something solid to hold on to. I said yes to him before she even asked. I didn't have a reason not to. The wedding was small, 40 people, outdoor ceremony in April, a venue outside Savannah with Spanish moss hanging from the old oaks. Theo's family came from Charleston, his mother, 2 younger brothers, a handful of cousins. His mother, Georgette, was a small woman who wore a lot of jewelry and spoke in a very particular tone, the kind that is always just slightly above you. Not rude, not warm either. Correct. Everything about her was carefully correct. I noticed her watching Imani during the reception, not the way a mother-in-law watches a new daughter-in-law with tenderness or hope, more like assessment, the way a person looks at a property before deciding whether it's worth the investment. I filed it in the back of my mind and told myself I was being professional. Occupational hazard. 31 years of assessing family dynamics had made me see warning signs in places where there weren't any. I told myself that for almost 2 years. The first thing I noticed, the actual first thing, looking back, was how Imani began to qualify everything she said around him. Not in big ways, just a hesitation before she spoke, like she was editing herself in real time. If I asked her on the phone what they'd had for dinner, she'd say something like, "We had pasta." "Well, Theo made it. It was really good." As if her own answer to a simple question needed his approval attached to it. I noticed it. I didn't name it. She stopped wearing her natural hair. That was the second thing. Imani had worn her locks for 6 years. She loved them. She'd spent years growing them and tended to them like a garden. About 8 months into the marriage, she cut them off. When I asked why, she said she just wanted a change. She said it lightly, quickly, and then she changed the subject. I didn't push. She started calling me less. When she did call, the conversations felt compressed, like she was working within a time limit she hadn't told me about. Sometimes I'd hear him in the background, not saying anything specifically, just present, and the call would wrap up shortly after. I told myself they were newlyweds. I told myself she was adjusting. I told myself a lot of things that year. Then came Thanksgiving. They came to my house that year, my house in Savannah. Imani, Theo, and Georgette, who had apparently decided she was included in the invitation. though I had not extended one to her specifically. I didn't say anything about it. I cooked enough. I set an extra place. We sat down to eat. I had made what I always make: roasted turkey, sweet potato casserole, collard greens, cornbread dressing, the macaroni and cheese that my mother taught me, and that Imani had asked me to make every Thanksgiving since she was 7 years old. Georgette looked at the table, picked up her fork, and said very pleasantly, "Theo doesn't eat pork, you know." I said, "There's no pork on the table." She said, "The greens." She said it the way you'd correct a child who'd made an honest but avoidable mistake. I looked at her. I said, "I cooked them with smoked turkey necks. I've been making them that way for 40 years. She smiled. She said, "I'm sure it's fine," in a tone that made it very clear she did not think it was fine. I watched Theo. He didn't correct her. He didn't say anything at all. He just looked at his plate and reached for his glass of water. And I watched Imani. She was looking at her hands. Not at me, not at Georgette, not at Theo. At her own hands, folded in her lap, as if she were somewhere else entirely. As if she had learned that when these moments came, the safest thing was to make herself very small and very still, and wait for it to pass. That image, my daughter at my own table, in my own house, making herself disappear, that image lived in me all through that meal. Through the small talk and the sweet potato casserole and Georgette's careful, pleasant commentary on everything and nothing. I smiled. I served. I cleaned up. But something in me had shifted. I started paying a different kind of attention after that. I started noticing the way Theo spoke to Imani in front of me. Not shouting, nothing so obvious as that. It was a kind of quiet redirection. If she said something he disagreed with, he didn't argue. He just looked at her with a very particular expression, patient, slightly disappointed, and she would walk back whatever she'd said. Every time. Without fail. As if she had been trained. I noticed that she no longer talked about her students the way she used to. Teaching had been her calling. She used to call me with stories. A kid who finally cracked reading. A parent who surprised her. A classroom moment that made her day. Those calls stopped. When I asked about work, she said it was fine, just fine. I noticed that she had stopped seeing her two closest friends. Both women she'd known since undergrad. She mentioned once that Theo felt they weren't a good influence, that they were too negative. She said it like she believed it. None of these things, taken alone, would have been enough. But I had worked in family court for 31 years. I knew what a pattern looked like. I knew the architecture of control, how it removes a person from the world piece by piece, methodically, until they are completely dependent on the one who is controlling them. I had written reports about it. I had testified about it. I had sat across from women who looked exactly like my daughter looked at Thanksgiving, and I had known from the first moment exactly what was happening to them. When it was happening to my own child, I had taken 2 years to name it. That is the thing I will carry the longest. In March, about 6 months after that Thanksgiving, Theo called me. He said Imani had been feeling overwhelmed lately, that she'd been struggling with stress, and that he thought it might help if they had some distance from extended family for a little while. He was very calm about it, very reasonable sounding. He said he just wanted to protect her, that he knew I'd understand given my background. He knew exactly what he was doing, using my background. He was telling me he understood the language. He was telling me he'd thought about this. I said, "Of course I understand. Tell her I love her." I hung up the phone. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time. Then I got in my car. I drove to their house in Pooler, about 25 minutes from mine. I didn't call first. I knocked on the door. Imani answered. She looked surprised to see me. Then she looked behind her, toward the interior of the house. Then she looked back at me. In the 3 seconds of that sequence, I understood everything I had been trying not to understand for 2 years. I asked if she wanted to come sit on the front porch with me. Just for a few minutes. Get some air. She looked behind her again. Then she stepped outside. She pulled the door almost closed behind her, but not all the way. We sat in the 2 rocking chairs on her porch. It was a cool March afternoon, and the azaleas along the front walk were just starting to come in. We didn't say anything for a minute. Just rocked. I said, "Tell me how you're really doing, baby." She started to say fine. I watched the word form in her mouth. Then her face broke. She cried for a long time. Not the kind of crying where you're looking for comfort. The kind where the pressure has simply become too much and the body just releases it regardless. She pressed her hands over her mouth and she cried, and I held her. And I didn't say anything because there was nothing to say yet. When she finally stilled, she told me. Not everything, not that day. It would take weeks for everything to come out. But enough. She told me about the way he spoke to her when they were alone, the way a meal she'd cooked could result in an evening of silence so cold she'd lie awake wondering what she'd done wrong, the way he'd explained slowly and with great patience over the course of 2 years all the ways that she was difficult, emotional, too sensitive, the way her friends had been described to her piece by piece until she'd let them go, the way she'd cut her locks because he'd mentioned once, just once, that he preferred her hair a different way, and she'd understood without being told directly that this was not optional. She hadn't told me because she was ashamed, and because she had believed for a while that he was right about her, that she was the problem. I kept my voice very level. It is a skill. 31 years of practice. I told her I believed her. I told her it was not her fault. I told her that what she was describing had a name, and that name was abuse, and that she was not crazy, and she was not difficult, and she was not too sensitive. I told her that what she was experiencing was something that happened to intelligent, capable women all the time, by design, because the design works. She asked me what she should do. I told her to let me make some calls. I want to tell you about the dinner, because that is the moment everything changed. About 3 weeks after that porch conversation, Imani told Theo that she wanted us all to have dinner together. Her, Theo, me, and Georgette, who was visiting from Charleston. She said it was to keep the peace, to show Theo she wasn't pulling away from the marriage. She told me this privately. She asked me to come. She said she needed me there. I came. We met at a restaurant in downtown Savannah, a nice place, white tablecloths, soft lighting, the kind of place where raised voices would be noticed. I had chosen it. Imani had suggested the location, but she'd chosen it because I had told her what kind of place to suggest. We ordered. Georgette was in her usual form, pleasant, correct, lightly superior. She made a comment about Imani's dress, delivered as a compliment in the way that is actually the opposite of a compliment, something about how it was brave to wear that color. Imani smiled. I smiled. We were about halfway through the meal when Imani said something about possibly going back to school. Just an idea she'd been thinking about, a doctoral program in education. She mentioned it the way you'd mention a daydream, gently, testing the air. Theo set down his fork. He looked at her, that look, the patient, slightly disappointed one. He said very quietly, "We've talked about this." Imani said, "I know, I just thought." He said, "Imani," just her name, the way you'd say it to a child who was embarrassing themselves. The table went quiet. Then he reached across. And I want to be careful here about what I say because I was there and I saw it and I will not minimize it. He grabbed her wrist. Hard. Not a tap. Not a touch. A grip. And he said low, "I said we've talked about this." Imani did not move. She looked at the table. And Georgette, his mother, sitting directly across from me, looked at her son's hand on my daughter's wrist and she smiled. A small, private smile, like a woman watching something go according to plan. I have seen a great many things in my life. I have sat in rooms with people who had done terrible things and maintained my composure. I have been trained for exactly this. The moment when emotion and professionalism are pulling in opposite directions and you have to choose. I chose professionalism because professionalism in that moment was the more dangerous weapon. I did not raise my voice. I did not stand up dramatically. I did not make a scene in that restaurant. I picked up my phone, which was on the table next to my water glass. I opened my contacts, and I made a call. The person I called was a colleague, a woman I had worked alongside for 11 years in family court. She was now the director of a domestic violence advocacy organization in the Savannah area with direct connections to legal aid, law enforcement liaisons, and emergency resources. We had stayed in close contact. I didn't say anything dramatic on the phone. I said her name. I said, "It's me. I need to move on that situation we discussed." That was all. I set the phone down. I looked at Theo. I looked at Georgette. I said, "I think dinner is finished." Then I looked at my daughter and I said, "Get your purse." She looked at me. Something passed across her face. Recognition, or maybe relief, the kind that comes when someone you trust finally shows up and says the thing you've been waiting to hear. She reached for her purse. Theo started to say something. I turned to look at him, and whatever he saw in my expression, he stopped. We left. In the parking lot, Imani started shaking, not from fear, or not only from fear. I think from the shock of having done something she hadn't believed she was capable of doing. Getting up, walking out, choosing herself. I held her arms and I said, "You did that. You stood up. Whatever comes next, you already did the hardest part." She stayed with me that night, and the night after, and the 3 months after that while the legal process moved forward. What I had discussed with my colleague before that dinner was not a crisis call. It was a plan. Because the week after I sat on Imani's porch and heard what she told me, I had gone home and I had made a series of very deliberate, very quiet calls. To my colleague's organization, to a family law attorney who had been referred to me through the legal aid network, to the 2 friends Imani had lost contact with, to make sure they were ready if and when she reached out, to Imani's principal at her school, not with details, but to establish that support was available and that her position was secure. I did not do any of this loudly. I did not confront Theo before that dinner. I did not give him the opportunity to prepare. 31 years in family court taught me that the window for a person to leave safely is often very small and very specific. You have to have everything in place before you open it, because if you open it too early, before the resources are ready, before the person is ready, it closes. I waited until Imani was ready, and then I made sure everything was already there when she walked through. The legal process was not fast, and it was not painless. I won't pretend otherwise. There were hearings. There was a restraining order that had to be filed and enforced. There were nights when Imani questioned herself, when the version of reality Theo had spent 2 years constructing would reassert itself, and she'd sit at my kitchen table at 2 a.m. and ask me if she'd overreacted. I would make her tea. I would sit with her. I would remind her as many times as it took of what was real. Georgette called me once, early in the process. She was very controlled on the phone. She told me that I had interfered in a private family matter, that Theo was a good man who loved his wife, that what happened at the dinner was a misunderstanding. I let her finish. Then I said, "I spent 31 years recognizing a misunderstanding from something else. I know the difference." She hung up. She did not call again. The divorce was finalized 8 months after that dinner. The attorney I'd connected Imani with was thorough, and the process, while difficult, was protective. Theo's behavior had a documented history by then. Not just what Imani described, but records my colleague's organization had helped compile. Nothing dramatic, just a clear, organized, factual account of what had happened. The kind of account that holds up. Imani is doing well now. That's the only part of this I want to dwell on, because the rest of it, Theo, Georgette, all of it, that's already taken enough of our time. She went back to her school in the fall. She got a small apartment in Savannah, close to me. She reconnected with her two friends who had been waiting, quietly, for exactly that call. She started wearing her hair natural again. Not locks this time. A different style. One that's hers. Last spring, she told me she'd been accepted to a doctoral program, education policy. She starts in the fall. She called me when she got the acceptance. She was crying, the other kind of crying, the kind that's made of something good. I cried too. I'm not too proud to admit that. She asked me once, about a year after everything, how I had known when to act. Why that night at the restaurant? Why not sooner? I told her the truth. I had known for a long time. But knowledge isn't the same as access. I couldn't act until she was in a position to act with me. Because leaving isn't something one person can do for another. You can build the bridge. You can make sure it's sound, but the person has to be the one to walk across it. She had walked across it herself the moment she reached for her purse. I just made sure the bridge was there. If you are watching this and something in this story feels familiar, if you are the daughter, if you are the friend, if you are the mother who has been noticing things and not yet naming them, I want you to hear this. What you are noticing is not nothing. Doubt dressed up in patience is still doubt. And the people who love you are often waiting for you to give them permission to help. Give them permission. And if you are the one who sees it happening to someone you love, be patient, be consistent, be ready. Build the bridge before they need it. And when they reach for their purse, be standing there. What would you have done in that moment at the dinner table, and what city are you watching from tonight? I keep coming back to that image of Imani at my table on Thanksgiving. Her hands folded in her lap, her eyes somewhere far away, making herself small in the chair she'd sat in her whole life. I've thought about it more times than I can count. And what I've come to understand is that the moment didn't begin at that dinner table. It began years earlier, in 100 small choices, his to control, hers to endure, and mine to look away. That's the hardest part of what I carry. Not what Theo did, not what Georgette permitted, what I almost let myself miss. There's something people don't talk about enough when it comes to situations like this one, the role that integrity plays. Not as a grand gesture, but as a daily practice. Theo lacked it completely, and I don't mean simply because he was cruel. I mean because he had built his entire relationship on a foundation of dishonesty. The charm was a performance. The patience was a tactic. The love he claimed was a mechanism of control. A person without genuine moral character doesn't suddenly become honest under pressure. They become more dangerous. And that's exactly what happened. The restaurant that evening wasn't an escalation that came from nowhere. It was the logical end of a pattern that had been running since the beginning. Imani had it in her all along, the clarity, the strength, but it had been systematically buried. That's what I want people to understand about what happened to my daughter. She wasn't weak. She was targeted precisely because she was capable and thoughtful and kind. Those qualities became the tools used against her. He dimmed her down piece by piece until she genuinely couldn't see herself clearly anymore. What brought her back was not a single dramatic moment. It was the slow accumulation of being told the truth consistently by someone she trusted. It was the work of rebuilding her own judgment, learning to trust what she observed, what she felt, what she knew. That kind of recovery takes real mental strength, not the loud kind, the quiet kind that gets up every morning and chooses, again, to believe in its own perception. Imani had to relearn herself, And she did it. She enrolled in that doctoral program. She laces up her shoes and runs every morning. She laughs again the way she used to laugh before she learned to edit herself. And Theo, what became of him was simply what had always been heading his way. Not because the universe punished him, because the consequences of how you treat people are real and they accumulate. A man who builds his life on controlling others has nothing underneath when the control is removed. That's not fate. That's just how things tend to go. I think about the 3 things I've tried to live by through 31 years of this work, and through everything that happened with my own daughter. Doing right even when no one is watching. Thinking clearly even when emotion is pulling hard in another direction. And holding steady even when holding steady is the most exhausting thing imaginable. Those 3 things, character, clear-headedness, and endurance, are not qualities you're born with fully formed. They're built, slowly, through every difficult moment you choose to meet honestly instead of turning away from. I turned away for too long. Then I stalked. That's the only story I know how to tell.